Today's mindful moment. Ever get the feeling that, I don't know, maybe we're not getting the full story?
Oh, all the time.
Like we're being, well, maybe not lied to exactly, but
Let along.
yeah, led along. That's exactly it.
It's a bit unnerving when you stop and really think about it.
That's exactly what we're going to be thinking about today. Diving into, well, a book that kind of shook things up back in 1960.
1960, wow.
A Nation of Sheep by William J. Lederer.
Oh, I've heard of this one. Pretty scathing critique of American apathy, wasn't it?
It was.
Eh.
And, even all these years later, it makes you wonder if some of those same criticisms might still ring true today.
That's the question, isn't it? Have we really changed all that much?
Well, Lederer doesn't hold back. He dives right into some pretty controversial stuff.
Like what?
Well, take the whole situation in Laos, for example.
Laos.
He calls it the Laos fraud, and it's pretty shocking.
I don't know much about that. What happened?
Basically, the U.S. almost went to war based on this completely bogus claim of a communist invasion.
Hold on. So we almost went to war because of bad intel.
That's what Lederer argues. He lays out all these factors: biased sources, lack of real investigation on the ground, and
Maybe we're more worried about looking good than telling the truth.
exactly. It's unsettling to think, how easily things could spiral out of control.
It makes you wonder what else we might be getting wrong.
Right. And the thing is, Lederer doesn't just point fingers at the government. He also takes the press to task.
What, for not reporting on this?
For not doing enough, yeah.
Yeah.
He says both the government and the media failed to give the American public the real story.
Keeping them in the dark.
Exactly. And that feeds into this whole nation of sheep idea. If we're not getting the truth, how can we even make informed decisions?
Right. You just sort of blindly follow along.
That's what he's getting at. And it gets even more interesting when he starts talking about Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of nationalist China.
The one and only. Now, back then, he was seen as this, heroic figure in the U.S.
Right. Fighting against communism.
But Lederer paints a very different picture.
Oh, how so?
He calls him a corrupt dictator who was basically using American aid to line his own pockets.
Wow. That's a pretty bold claim.
It was, especially back in 1960 at the height of the Cold War. But Lederer goes even further. He talks about this orchestrated riot against the U.S. Embassy in Taipei.
A riot?
Yeah, and then a complete media blackout of the truth about what really happened.
So wait, not only was there a riot, but then there was an attempt to cover it up?
That's what Lederer suggests. And it makes you think, who benefits from suppressing information like that? And how much of what we believe is actually shaped by, forces we're not even aware of?
It's a bit scary when you think about it that way.
And Lederer doesn't stop there. He takes on something that, on the surface seems like a good thing, the U.S. Foreign Student Program.
Huh. I wouldn't have thought of that as controversial. What's the issue?
Well, he argues that it might actually be doing more harm than good, like backfiring.
Really? How so?
He says it's all about, how the programs run. He points to things like not choosing the right students, not enough chances for them to, really experience American culture, and just a general lack of real connection with Americans.
So they're not getting a good impression of the U.S.
Yeah, and then they go back home with, maybe a negative view.
That's a shame. It seems like a missed opportunity to build bridges,
Exactly. And he has this one story, it really stuck with me, about a Cambodian student who felt totally ignored here.
Ignored.
Yeah, like invisible. And then Lederer contrasts that with how this student was treated by, I think it was the Burdick family, and how welcoming they were.
So he's saying that even small gestures can make a big difference.
Right. It's all about those human connections, building relationships instead of just, lecturing people about how great America is.
So where does Lederer say the blame lies for all this? I mean, for this nation of sheep problem?
Well, he points to a few different things. First, he kind of takes apart the whole way the U.S. gathers information about the world.
What's wrong with it?
He says we rely too much on, foreign officials who might be biased, and we don't always understand foreign media correctly.
So we're getting a skewed picture.
Yeah, and then he brings up the whole issue of government secrecy.
Oh, yeah, the good old classified stamp.
Right. He uses this example of, reports about foreign suppliers overcharging the U.S. government.
So information that affects us directly, but we're not allowed to know about it.
Exactly. How can we be informed citizens if we're kept in the dark?
It makes you feel pretty powerless, actually.
And of course, Lederer doesn't let the press off the hook either. He says they often make things worse.
Worse? How?
By publishing stuff that isn't confirmed, relying too much on official statements, and just generally going for the sensational stuff instead of really digging deep.
Oh, so that whole if it bleeds, it leads thing.
Exactly. He even brings up this crazy story about the Matsu invasion.
The what?
Matsu. It was this island, and American journalists basically published this whole story about a Chinese invasion.
Which turned out to be false.
Yeah, but the thing is, even though these journalists weren't allowed to actually see what was going on, they still went ahead and published the story.
Just based on what they were being told.
Right. Shows you how easy it is for misinformation to spread, even when it comes from, supposedly reliable sources.
Especially these days with the internet and everything, it's tough to know what to believe.
So Lederer was painting a pretty bleak picture, right? But the good news is he also offers some solutions.
Oh, good. What does he suggest?
Some pretty radical ideas, actually. Like, he proposes creating this permanent core of international experts.
International expert.
Yeah. Basically, these would be people who are fluent in tons of languages, understand different cultures, and can give unbiased analysis of what's happening around the world.
Sounds like a dream team of global citizens.
Right. Lederer thought they could help avoid the kind of foreign policy messes he was writing about.
Makes sense. Get some real experts in the room.
But he didn't stop there. He also had this idea about using what he called wasted manpower.
Wasted manpower? What does that even mean?
Basically, guys who were rejected from the military for, like, physical reasons, but who were still, smart and capable.
Okay. And what would they do?
He wanted to create a strategic service corps that would work overseas, like building things, promoting cultural exchange, and basically being ambassadors for America.
Interesting. So non-military ways to engage with the world.
Exactly. Lederer believed that this kind of people-to-people diplomacy was key to, winning hearts and minds.
It's a cool idea. But what about us regular folks? What can we do to, not be sheep?
That's what I was going to ask. What are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, Lederer says it all starts with taking personal responsibility. We need to be more active citizens.
Like how?
Writing to our elected officials, going to town hall meetings, actually talking to each other about important issues.
So not just complaining on social media.
Right. It's about actually doing something. And he also says we need to be smarter about how we consume information.
Like fact check everything.
Well, yeah, that's part of it. But it's also about, getting your news from a variety of sources, not just the ones you agree with.
Stepping outside that echo chamber.
Exactly. Lederer even suggests subscribing to newspapers like the New York Times or Christian Science Monitor.
Okay, so good journalism matters.
It does. It's worth paying for.
That's a good point. Supporting the things we value.
And let's not forget about personal connections. Lederer's story about that Cambodian student really highlights how important it is to, reach out to people who are different from us.
Building those bridges.
Right, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we have more in common than we think.
It's like he's saying, hey, wake up. Start paying attention.
Right. Don't just be a passive consumer.
So how do we do that? Where do we even begin?
Well, Lederer gives us some ideas, both, for society as a whole and for each of us individually.
Let's start with the individual stuff. What can we do?
He really stresses personal responsibility. Be an active citizen.
Okay, that sounds good, but what does that actually look like?
Write to your elected officials. For starters, go to town hall meetings. Actually talk to people about what's going on in the world.
So not just ranting on Twitter.
Right. Actually engage, make your voice heard. And then there's how we consume information.
Be more careful about what we read and watch.
Yeah, be critical. Get your news from different sources, not just the ones that confirm what you already believe.
And Lederer even suggests specific publications, right?
Yeah, he mentions the New York Times and Christian Science Monitor as examples of good, in-depth journalism.
So supporting quality journalism is important.
It is. Those kinds of publications need our support to keep doing what they do.
I hadn't really thought about it that way before.
And, it's not all about reading and watching the news. Remember Lederer's story about the Cambodian student?
The one who felt ignored.
Yeah. That story reminds us about the power of just connecting with people who are different from us.
Making an effort to understand each other.
Right. Break down those barriers,
It's like we all have biases, right? But we have to try to see past them.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into A Nation of Sheep, what's your biggest takeaway? Anything that really hit home for you?
I think for me, it's kind of a two-parter. First, that we need to be skeptical, question everything, really think for ourselves.
Informed skepticism. I like that.
And then the second part is, to be open to changing our minds.
Yeah.
If someone presents a good argument, we shouldn't just shut it down because it doesn't fit with what we already believe.
Be willing to learn and grow.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And I think Lederer's book is a good reminder that, democracy takes work.
It's not a spectator sport.
Right. We can't just sit back and expect things to magically get better.
We have to participate, be informed, and hold our leaders accountable.
Well said. This has been a really thought-provoking discussion. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into A Nation of Sheep.
It's been a pleasure. It's a book that really makes you think, and I think it's as relevant today as it ever was.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about Lederer's arguments, we've got a link in the show notes where you can buy the book. Definitely worth a read.
You'll challenge your thinking, that's for sure.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics.
We cover everything from history and science to philosophy and what's happening in the world right now.
Always with the goal of helping you become a more informed and engaged citizen. So tell your friends about the show, share this episode, and until next time, keep those minds sharp and stay curious.